Hello, everyone. So the title of the talk I'm giving today is What Agencies Want from Extension Providers, and I'm going to go through my top 10 list. So I got a brief introduction there. I work at Something Digital. I'm a technical lead for our strategic engagement group. I do a lot of blogging. I put my website up there. You can check it out. I write about Magento. I also just write about technology in general. And as mentioned, I was recognized as one of the top 50 Magento contributors in both 2017 and 2018. So before getting into things, I just wanted to kind of give the reason for why I'm giving this talk. So the idea is I work at a Magento agency, and we are implementing Magento extensions. So what I'm looking to do is provide a feedback loop to the companies and people that are building Magento extensions from a person like me who's actually working at a company that's actually implementing these extensions for clients. And through that feedback loop, what I'm looking to do is present a comprehensive list of common issues that I've encountered working at an agency to present them to the extension providers so that ideally they can be worked into the processes of these extension providers. And before diving into this, I did want to throw up a disclaimer. So I'm not currently and have never been in the business of selling Magento extensions. So I'm going to present kind of a list of demands, but I acknowledge that I don't have the full perspective of being on the other side of things, and I'm, don't know fully what it would look like to operationalize all these things. Okay, so I'm going to start each section with a quote. This is a pretty famous quote. If you're on the tech track, you've probably heard it. I've actually included it in my presentations before. There are only two hard things in computer science: caching, validation, and naming things. And I've talked about caching a lot, but today I actually want to talk about naming things. So this is something that I want as an agency working as an extension, with an extension from an extension provider is I want to be able to easily find the correct extension via a Google search given the name of the module in the code base. This is a challenge that I've run into on a somewhat regular basis. So how do you do this? So if I'm looking at a code base and I see a module is installed, I can see the vendor underscore module in a file like module.xml. I can see vendor/module in composer.json. I will try to Google these to find back what extension somebody purchased at some point that led to this code being installed. And you'd be surprised sometimes how difficult or even impossible it is from these signs to figure out which extension is actually installed on the code base. So what I'm proposing is anytime you have a web page that's selling a Magento installation, just include these keywords somewhere in the text for the page that's selling that installation. And then if they're Googled, it will very clearly be able to say, OK, this is the module that's installed. And then I can read the documentation, see the changelog, et cetera. OK, next thing. This is a quote, potential quote that maybe an extension provider might say. Potential security issues were fixed. So the next thing that I want working at an agency is around vulnerability disclosure. So if there's a security issue in your module, first and foremost, I want to know about them, which if you say potential security issues are fixed, you've at least acknowledged that there is an issue. But beyond that, I also want to understand the severity of the issue, and I want to be able to check if my clients are impacted by this issue. So I'm going to kind of break this down into two parts. So first of all is knowing about the issue. So I understand why if you work at an extension provider, what the incentive is to kind of sweep it under the rug and not make it public. It's obviously not great press, which is unfortunate that security journalists tend to sensationalize these things. But on the other side, if you don't make this public knowledge, people who are impacted by this issue are not going to be able to find out about it, and they're more likely to be hacked as a result of it. So first of all, don't sweep it under the rug. Once you've gotten over that hump, the next question is how do you acknowledge the issue? If you have a list of email addresses of people who have installed this extension and purchased this extension, definitely go ahead and email that list, letting them know about the issue. But that's not really going to be a great way to reach everybody that has the extension installed. The reason for that is the extension may have been purchased by an agency who was working on the project at one point, and then the merchant moved to a new agency, and then you're sending that email alert to an old agency who's not even working on that anymore. So beyond that, another good way to announce these things is on social media. There's a lot of people who are active in the Magento community who are on social media, especially Twitter, and would be likely to see these things, and that can be a good way to kind of have it funnel down through agencies to actually get remediated and addressed for clients. Another thing to look at is Mage VulnDB. I've included a link up here. It's a public, open database. It's really just a CSV file on GitHub that's tracking vulnerabilities in Magento modules. And there are security scanning tools that are hooked into this. People have built this into processes, have custom jobs that look at this thing. So this is another great way to acknowledge the issue. And in addition to that, I would encourage you to use an RSS changelog when you have updates to your module, especially security. What this allows me to do as an agency is subscribe to the RSS feed. And then even if an old company bought it, I can subscribe to it and I can get all those updates. So I mentioned that acknowledging it is the first part, but there's more to it than that. So in addition to acknowledging it, there's some information that you should also provide when you do so, not just say potential security issues were fixed. If you just say that, I don't know how important this is. Is this critical for my clients to have to drop everything we're doing and address this? Or is this, there are probably mitigating factors in place. We need to address this, but it doesn't need to be a full-on emergency response. So tell me, what type of a vulnerability is it? Is it remote code execution? Is it SQL injection? Is it cross-site scripting, et cetera? Really important is to define the access requirements. So if exploiting this vulnerability requires the attacker to have admin access, that's a very different type of an issue than an issue that can be exploited with no privileged access at all. I also want to be able to know if my clients are impacted by it. Sometimes in very old versions of the module, you're not impacted, and it's after a certain version and then fixed in a later version, and there's a range you need to be in. Sometimes extension providers use kind of their own proprietary ways for tracking versions. Some of them use properties in some PHP class. So you have to make it clear for people how they can actually check if they're impacted by this issue. And this subject of vulnerability disclosure, I could go on and on. I could probably give a whole talk on. So I also am pointing you to a blog post I've written which goes even more into detail on this specific aspect. OK, next section. So here's another potential quote from an extension provider. Thank you for contacting us. In order to efficiently service your request, please provide us SSH sudo access to your production environment, extension provider. So what do agencies want? This is around support. So when I report an issue to you, I want you to handle it without immediately, especially, asking me for SSH access to my client's environment. So how do you do this? I work in support too, and I understand that without access, it can become very difficult to solve the type of requests that are coming in through support. So some tips, at least in going back to the disclaimer, I don't work in an extension provider, but I would imagine if you have some standard template for reporting issues through, it can help to kind of provide some structure and help you do an initial triage on the issue. So steps to reproduce this issue, expected result, actual result. You can go and test it against out-of-box Magento and see, is this just a bug? Is this legitimately a bug in the module, or does this not reproduce an out-of-box, and is there something else going on? In addition to the template, obviously you'll need some diagnostic information, potentially what version of the module is installed, what version of Magento is installed, what version of PHP, et cetera, et cetera. So potentially you can build tools within the module to help you gather those type of information. And then finally, if you reach an issue that truly doesn't reproduce on an out-of-box Magento, and you're being asked to help out for it, that is a situation where you need to be able to actually troubleshoot it. I understand that, but we have larger clients who it's a very big deal to let somebody get into their environment, and it's not an easy process to go through. So I understand that there's probably some potential additional costs to this, and I think that's fully reasonable, but providing a service where you can get a support engineer on a call with us, we can do a demo, a screen share, show them what's happening. We can even collaboratively troubleshoot it. Providing this type of service, I think, would be extremely valuable to me as an agency, or working at an agency. Okay, next thing. Another potential quote from an extension provider. Our code is IonCube encoded for licensing, extension provider. So what do agencies want? We want the source code. I want to be able to read 100% of your extension's source code. Why do I want this? So sometimes a client is reporting something about the way that the extension operates, and you may have great documentation about it, but it's impossible to cover all the nuances. So sometimes as a developer, I really just want to look at the code and see what's actually going on so I can understand it for myself and explain it to my client instead of saying, sorry, the code is encoded, I can't answer your question, you're going to have to go. We're going to have to take this up with the support from the extension. I'd like to be able to look at it myself. And in addition to that, sometimes we have requests where we need to extend or customize the functionality of the extension. And if the source code is obfuscated or encrypted in some way, it becomes very challenging or even impossible to do these type of things. So pretty basic, but working as an agency, this is pretty important to us. Okay. So we're flipping the quote. Now it's not an extension provider anymore. It's an agency Magento developer, and they're talking to a client. And they say, your site is down because a Magento extension timed out calling a third-party service. So what agencies want? This is around resilience. So if a service that your module depends on goes down, I don't want it to cause the entire website to go down. You may be providing a very critical functionality, shipping rates, tax calculations, et cetera, which understandably will block potentially critical workflows like checkout, but keep in mind that other people are not checking out. They may be browsing the site. They may be looking at content pages on the site. They may be checking the status of their order. So even if in these critical areas, if that service goes down, I wouldn't expect it to crash the entire website. So what does this mean? So if you're going to curl a third-party service on the back end, make sure you set a timeout on that request. If you don't, what happens is that they start to pile up, and enough of them will topple over the entire website. And in addition to that, whenever you can, design your workflows to be asynchronous. So an example of this would be a fraud calculation, a fraud protection service. So one way you could do that is when somebody clicks place order, in real time, you could go over to the fraud service and say, hey, here's the order, give me a score so I can handle it right away. Or you could take the order, and then you could put it on hold for a little bit, and then you could have a separate job that runs in the background on a queue that goes through all of them and says, hey, score them. What's the fraud score? And then only once it passes that does it flow through to fulfillment. And that's just one less point of failure that you can introduce to your checkout process. And then this is not only a back-end issue. I've also seen JavaScript embeds that have gone down and have basically led to a white screen for 30 seconds until the browser terminates the request. So when you're embedding third-party front-end scripts as well, that's another thing to be careful of, to do that asynchronously and make sure it's done in a way that won't effectively cause the site to go down if that third-party JavaScript becomes unavailable. Okay, so extension provider again. Our extension adds additional columns to sales order and quote to record additional data, extension provider. So this is around deployment. So I want to be able to deploy your module without my client site being down for 3 hours during setup upgrade. Those tables, sales order and quote, can get very big, and the alteration of them can be very time consuming on a very large data set. So your module should try to avoid altering these tables wherever possible. And instead, you should create your own tables, and then you can use relationships back to the core tables as needed. And then another thing, this is, I have a link to an XDN article about Magento 2 development. This is something they bring up, but it's also around deployment, is to not increase the setup version if you don't need to. So if you're releasing a new version of your module, that does not mean you need to increase the setup version of the module. You should increase the module version in Composer, but you should only, that does not need to be in sync with setup version. You only should increase the setup version when you have schema changes. Okay. We reviewed disk space usage on the database instance and found the extension provider, Amazing Extension log table, was using 100 gigabytes of space. Agency Magento developer. So what do agencies want? We want log cleanup. So if your extension is going to log data to the database, I would expect that you will clean that up. And this is specifically to the database. If you're logging to files, that's the responsibility of the operating system and log rotate to take care of those. But in the case of the database, that's your job to make sure you're cleaning those logs periodically. So how you do this, use a cron job to periodically clean up the log data. Bonus points if you have configuration options for a retention period, so that if you're debugging an issue and you need it longer, or maybe you're good, you can keep it shorter. That's also helpful as well. When you're doing this, you also need to be very responsible with big deletes. We had one module that we were working with that specifically during deleting data, it would lock a lot of tables, and it caused the entire website to go down. So you need to be careful with doing this. This can be a dangerous thing to do. I've included a link to a blog post that has some good information about how to responsibly delete a lot of data. And then the last thing is to be mindful of the Magento cron. If you're running this job on the default cron group, you may block other things. So if this job is going to potentially take a long time, you should think about putting it on its own cron group. OK, so that was my initial set of ideas. And then what I did was I went onto social media, and I shared that I was giving this talk, and I kind of crowdsourced some additional ideas. So I got a lot of great feedback on it, and I pulled out a few of my favorites, and I just wanted to share them at the end here. So this one comes from Luke Rogers. Stop making your extension call home on every admin action. So this goes to kind of two of the points I already talked about, but can also stand on its own. So first of all, there are security concerns potentially with this. You're exposing information about that admin server or admin URL potentially to a third-party service, which could potentially be the target of a supply chain attack. Not only that, it also goes back to the resiliency factor. Are you setting a timeout? Or are you being responsible with the calling home? Are you going to cause the entire website to go down again during this call home? So calling home is not really a thing that we like at all, and especially on admin actions, and especially on every admin action. This one is almost so common sense that I didn't even think to include it, but I think it does bear repeating. So make sure that your module can be installed via Composer. I consider installing a module into app code as essentially technical debt. So make sure you're supporting Composer installs. And then finally, a detailed changelog. I brought up changelogs already in the case of the RSS changelog for security issues, but there are other use cases where a changelog comes in super handy. So if you have a detailed one, I can see all the fixes and new improvements that were added in each version. And if a client reports an issue to me or a new feature request, I can look at the changelog and see, oh, if you upgrade to this version, that issue's fixed or that new feature's available. Not only that, but the changelog also helps provide me some information about how active the development is on this extension. So how many releases are there? How often are they doing releases? A changelog is a very good indicator for those type of things. So in summary, started out with naming things. Make sure that vendor_module and vendor/module can be Googled and linked back to the actual module that you're selling. Be transparent about security issues. Ask for SSH only as a last resort, and provide alternative support options as available. Don't obfuscate your source code. Plan for failure when calling any third-party services. Avoid altering core schema. Clean any database logs. Don't call home from the admin panel. Support Composer installs, and provide a detailed changelog. And that is it.
All right, great job, Max. Thank you. Who has questions?
Just a quick one. So, coming from a merchant perspective, we've seen some extensions that actually break core Magento functionality. For example, our subscription plugin eliminates things like we can't do e-commerce bundles, just as one example. There's other things that happen. So maybe that's something you want to comment on, or maybe for the list is, I know there's complexities in creating an extension that adds functionality, but let's not break what's built in out of the box in Magento.
Yeah, I mean, I would expect that the extension is compatible with all core Magento features. If it's not, I would report that to the extension provider and say, hey, this, I installed your extension completely vanilla Magento out of box. I'm trying to use this feature and it's not working anymore. And when I remove that extension, the feature works fine. I would expect that it should support that. So if that's an issue that's happening, an evaluation needs to be, and the extension provider is either A, not going to fix it, or it's going to you don't know how long it's going to take to fix. It's kind of a question at that point of, should we fix this ourselves? Should we look for an alternative? Or is this not really that, do we not need this feature that badly? You kind of have, it's kind of a case-by-case basis, I would say, at that point.
Okay, next question.
Hi.
Hey.
How you doing, Max?
Hey, James.
Good to see you.
You too.
As an extension developer yourself, and as a thought leader, I hate the term, but you fit it, in the space, an advisor of other extension developers, how important do you feel it is for a merchant to be able to install an extension off Marketplace without even typing in a Composer command? A fully automated, no developer intervention install of an extension. And that is a use case for some, obviously not for most, but for some, and I wondered what you think is the importance of that and how that fits into the future of your business and others.
In our case, I mean, I don't think any of our clients that we work with would be doing that. We would always want to do source code control. And not only that, we also do code review of extensions before we will install them on our client sites, as much as we can. So that use case is, like, I know you could do that on WordPress, right? But it's a security issue too, because then you need to be able to write to the file system to install those files. I don't know that in the e-commerce, like WordPress or something like that is much lower risk, where you're not handling financial data. Personally, this is my gut reaction. Maybe I could be convinced otherwise if I sat down and had a conversation with somebody who felt strongly in the other direction. But personally, my gut reaction is that that feature doesn't need to be available.
You've made me a very happy man today.
Anyone else want to be made happy today? Here we go.
So yeah, I'm part of XDN, and first of all, your blog post was mentioned by us internally. The Twitter poll that you had. And actually, I think a lot of the points are worth actually spreading among extension providers as well, and we'll do that. However, a couple of the points that you mentioned were like really bad things an extension could do, and a couple of others were more like debatable, or some others, some other points were like nice to have, but maybe not really that mandatory.
Mm-hmm.
Which is leading basically to the question like, okay, if an extension provider is making a mistake, then maybe together we can just try to correct that mistake. But if an extension provider is failing on all of the different points, what would be your vision of getting rid of such an extension vendor?
Getting rid.
Yeah, so
I don't fully understand exactly how.
no, so basically it's like the future that I try to get to. Basically, if there's a lot of extensions out there that are failing on all of the different
Okay.
points, what should we do? How should we react?
Yeah. So, I mean, I think if people at agencies start to look at these type of things and start to evaluate these extensions through a set of criteria, I would hope that that would evolve somehow to people that aren't following these best practices to naturally them not getting recommended and, you know, either them adapting to them or else they're going to fail. That would be my hope for how we can do it. As far as uninstalling or removing them, yeah, I mean, uninstalling, it's technical debt, which is always hard to pay back, right? Because it's like, you don't know about it until it's a problem. So right up front, you can't see the value in paying back that technical debt. So as an agency, we have to have the discussion with the client, but it is an investment, right, that they may not see immediate ROI from too. So it's a tricky one.
All right, that's all the time that we have. One more round of applause for Max Chadwick.